Hello everyone, this is Freddie Hussing again. This video is going to be specifically going a little bit more in depth into the mobile side of our project. I'm going to first go through the diagrams that um, I said before I was going to go a little bit deeper on. So we will be talking about the registration process and the overall class diagram for the application. After that, what I'll do is I'll reference some of the senior project documentation that we've done, just because I want to highlight some key points, and I also want to look at some of the code and give some sort of a flow as to how the code works and how it's processed, and finally running the project, right? So let's get started on the registration. Go to the page. Afterwards, you create it. Reference that in there is where services gets created. Then that were credential pictures that we mentioned of the a little bit for generally person. Then you make, which I would do. I talked about since API and then it responds. Now let me quickly go over documentation stuff here. Okay, so you can look at the setup more deeply later on, but I just want to highlight some key parts. This part is essential because I'm not sure if I'll be leaving my subscription key over here. You must, and again, you must change this key, because this is how you basically link your application to Microsoft Cognitive Services. That's how they know who you are, and this needs to be passed in the header. But if you just change this, it will be automatically done every time that you do any API request. You don't need to worry about that. Just worry about changing the key. By default, we use person group ID 0. That's our test group. You can create more groups. It's up to you. There's no real requirement besides that. But if your product owner doesn't want that, then go ahead and adjust for that. Besides that, okay, yeah, you do need an Apple developer, a free develop the camera. Something called, just make sure you install, and just make sure before we run the application, let's go over a little code overview. So again, I told you, there's pretty much a view controller for every part of the application. The main storyboard is kind of like the UI layout. We're not doing the UI programmatically, so we just basically drag and drop, and that's how we basically set up the layout. So as you can clearly see, there is 4 controllers. This is just a navigation controller, but it doesn't really have any specific file attached to it. And then here's basically the home page, registration, when you extract stuff, and then the confirmation for the training status. So from here on, I'm going to go ahead and go through each one of these files, explain what's going on, and then I'll also address the parameters class, the request class, and then some of the other files here that you might be curious about. All right, so let's start with the homepage file. This is called view controller. The reason why I call it a homepage file is because it's supposed to be named like that. The reason why we haven't been able to change it is because refactoring the name has somewhat done like a lot of bugs in the app. So that needs to be a task that needs to be taken care of for later parts of the app, just for clarification. But yeah, all right, cool. So this is the homepage that we saw right off. So since we're using socket.io for communications, this part of the code is really important, because this is how we establish our socket connection to the desktop application. Huge thing to highlight here is this little ngrok link over here. This ngrok link is only live for 7 hours. So anytime that you want to run this application and check for a socket connection, you got to make sure that not only you and the desktop application have the same ngrok link, but that the link is new as well. So make sure you change this part when you're doing that. This is just a reference, so we can do API requests from the API request class, which I'll go into later. All right, going here into the main page. We have our basic constructor for the view did load, not constructor, but basically this is what initializes some of the UI on the background, and then also we have some authentication happening here to see if the user is currently logged in or not. Because, and again, this is a part of sort of like our restrictions. We weren't able to use the notification systems in the Apple developer program, so we had to resort to use Firebase's authentication systems as the means to sort of implement a way of keeping track if the user is still logged in when they close the app or not. So that's what we're doing over here. We're checking if there's a user, and then we're setting the person ID for that user that it corresponds to its UID. And then depending on the communication between the desktop, if the desktop says If we send them a create, they will then create a user on their side, and then if they send us an authenticate, we will then open up the camera on our phone and take a picture of ourselves, and that will validate it, and so on and so on. This over here is just a listener. It basically just keeps track of the current state of the user, um, and then it allows to see if the user has been logged out or not. Now, I mentioned earlier that you would take a picture, right, when you're prompted from the desktop application. Well, what exactly gets called? So this here, the image picker controller, it gets automatically called. You won't see it on the code, but in the inner works of the application, it gets called automatically. So this is how the picture will be taken. Now, what we want to do is once we have the picture, we want to go ahead and run the detect face request API. That way we kind of extract a face ID from it and then compare it. This, by its implementation, the detect face API in our implementation already calls the verify request in it. So that's why we get a results with a given amount of confidence, right? So how sure that we are that this person is identical or not. And then we have a simple logout button just for testing purposes. It logs out any user. Besides that, some key points to highlight. If it's the first time opening the camera in your phone, the iOS system will let you know if they have permission to do that. But that's already in the info.playlist file. So sort of like what appears when the user gets prompted to do that. All right, so next page. This is where the user will input their email and the password. We must set up a database reference over here, which means that we need this imports over here. Now let's unpack this a little bit. Setting up UI again. The reference. Let's see. All right, so here we're basically passing all this information to the next page. Now, why are we doing this instead of just doing it in this page? Well, we want to process all this information at once, creating the person ID, creating the Firebase entity, creating the, sending all the images, because that's literally the registration process. So in order to do that, we have to forward these variables into the next page. So that way on the next page, once we have the pictures, we can just process everything all at once. Other things to highlight over here would be there's a text thing that I want to talk about. Oh, there we go. Here it is. All right, yeah. So this is what allows a button to basically, when you click done, for it to be actually done and hide the keyboard. Keep this in mind if you're trying to implement a similar functionality. It's really this simple. So don't worry about it. Just make sure you look at this piece of code. Next page, right? So we have all our variables right now. Key point to highlight here is that the seg here basically allows us to but send or forward information from this class with its current state to the next page. So that's why these things over here get populated from previous parts. So here we have a first, second, and third image. Again, part of the system improvements is that we should make this to be up to whatever amount of images we want, right? But right now we have it hard-coded to 3 images. Again, UI stuff, reference database. Here we're taking a picture, and then that gets the image controller done. And now here is where we assign each image to itself. Now here's where all the registration part happens. So we're making sure that we create a person. I'll go a little bit about the hierarchy of person and person group a little bit. And so we upload each individual image, right? We call the add face request. Then we create a user using the authentication. Again, this is part of the reason why we forward the information, so we can just do all this stuff over here. Now finally we have the training status screen, which basically just tells you the status of the training. And then you have the option to go home, which is just goes to the home button, and then you can actually keep on testing to see if you actually have a user or not. API response, again, this is just feels that this is basically, I will look at the documentation, see what the response is, and then basically create a variable for each of those response fields according to whatever I'm expecting. So sometimes I'll expect a Boolean, sometimes I would expect a string. It depends on the documentation for that, right? Same with the request. So when I'm doing objects to send to a given request, I would just use one of these. Um, and then all right, there's a lot of API requests here, but I'm just gonna go through two of them to just give you a gist of how they work. So we have the add phase request, right? So there we have an image, we have the URL, we need a URL, an upload task to be able to do an API request. Here's where we do that information. I encourage you to read the documentation on upload tasks, so that way you can expedite some of the um, if you want to do like new API requests, you can understand it better. We have a completion. So major key over here, you're going to see all these escaping signs. This is because we're expecting a response object if it fails or if it passes, right? So if it passes, we get the former. If it fails, we get the latter. And these are all objects that we coded before, right? So when we look at the verify message, that's right over here, right? Um, and right over here. So we'll pass it as parameters. But basically, once it's done, this is what it's saying is that when it's done, it's going to expect this object to come back, and so on and so forth. You're going to see sort of this nested structure because for some of these requests, like for example, the detect face request, we need to have a callback function that has a person ID to be able to keep going forward with verifying that person. If we don't have that field that we get from an API request, then we can't keep going with the program. So that's what we're doing over here. But besides that, so those cases over here, it's basically in alignment with those completion handlers that we talked about over here. I encourage you to read about it also in the Apple documentation. So here is just a bunch of fonts. But besides that, that is a core application. I'm going to do a quick run. So I'm just going to hit Command R, waiting for it to show up. And then I'm just going to give you a quick show. It always takes a little bit, so just don't worry if it's taking a while. So right now we're not locally connected to the socket, but I'll give you the flow. A lot of these can be error checked. So this is where you create your account, you input, whatever you want, submit that, and you take all those pictures. You can take pictures if you're in the simulator. You need to be doing it on the actual phone. So make sure you take care of that, and then you go back to the home page. So on a separate video, I'll go a little bit more in depth into some other parts of the code. Well, not in the code, but like the structure and some things to highlight. But basically, make sure you follow the documentation that we leave, and you should be good to go. Thank you for watching.